We who must now continue to wrestle with the growing reality of economic injustice in America, we who are challenged to face the fact that this nation has no humane future if it does not deal with the rehumanizing of its cities. We who remember King's unceasing warnings about the triple American evils of racism, militarism, and materialism are engaged and assisted much more fully by the King of the post-1963 years than by an earlier, more convenient hero. My hope is that we might press ourselves beyond amnesia and engage the tougher, more difficult King. As with Malcolm, one of King's most significant characteristics in his last years was his willingness to take great risks on behalf of hope, to shake himself free of the more familiar, triumphant settings, and to break loose toward the solitary unchartedness of the wilderness, especially if that exploratory movement might help him to respond more faithfully to the cries of the poor, the vulnerable, and the marginalized women, men, and children of our nation and our world. Perhaps the memory of Martin King needs to be broken free from all official attempts to manage, market, and domesticate him. At this time, we need a truly free and inconvenient hero, one who may help us to explore new dimensions of our freedom, not simply as a private agenda, but to follow his unmanageable style of seeking and using freedom to serve the needs of the most vulnerable, the most unfree among us. My concern here is that we stop holding King captive to his most pliant history in order that he might help us break free toward our most creative future as persons, as communities, as a nation. How else will we be worthy of such a magnificently inconvenient hero? How else will we discover the hero within us all? Not one of those was a word of my own. Those words came from a remarkable little book by Dr. Vincent Harding, the central tenet of which is that the Martin King of our popular culture, and the one most often quoted, is a relatively easy and convenient Martin Luther King. The tendency, he writes, is to remember and celebrate the I Have a Dream speech of 1963, and how could we forget? The words he spoke that day, the moral authority, the passion of his belief, not to mention an exquisite sense of timing and cadence and inflection, have inspired two generations of activists and remain some of the most often quoted words of the 20th century. But Harding's point is that the I Have a Dream Martin King was a Martin King still very much in transition, a man privately wrestling with even bigger questions, a man troubled by a growing sense that racial equality was only the beginning. My hope this morning is to explore a little bit of the more difficult Martin King after I Have a Dream, and may shed a little light on why the civil rights leader of 1963 made many in power uncomfortable, but it was his later growth in activities toward economic and foreign policy activism that was much more frightening to the American establishment. I also hope to explore a little bit the Christian faith of Martin Luther King that fueled and sustained him from start to finish. You might remember, if you lived through that time, or if you've read some history, that it was only a few weeks after the I Have a Dream speech that the bomb went off in the 16th Street Baptist Church, killing 4 little girls. It was a year and a half after I Have a Dream that the first march in Selma, Alabama was turned back by attack dogs and water hoses. 70 marchers were hospitalized, 2 were killed. It was in this period that King began to publicly ask deeper questions. Questions that got him into trouble not only with the authorities, but with other black leaders. He began to articulate the connection between poverty and violence. a connection that we as a country still have not really understood. He began to articulate the unintended consequences of a materialist ethic and culture, and how a focus on material things and acquisitions would inevitably devalue human beings and help to institutionalize poverty for all races. He'd begun to articulate that this would mean questioning some of the fundamental assumptions that underlie our entire society, questions about capitalism, about power, opportunity, and privilege, and how these abstractions get lived out in policies both very explicit and in habits of being and habits of thinking that are deeply hidden. He had begun to reshape the movement beyond racial equality to a much broader and more inclusive justice. He began to speak not just for civil rights, but about foreign policy. He spoke out strongly against the Vietnam War. He called attention to our secret agendas and practices in Central America and our tacit approval of apartheid in South Africa. He spoke out about the economic investment in places like Asia, Africa, and South America, investments from the United States which inevitably aligned the powerful of the United States with the often torturously violent and oppressive regimes of those nations. He spoke out against the power of the military-industrial complex, even then swallowing vast amounts of money and resources while millions lived in slums and ghettos. Here's a passage from Martin King in 1967. I want to say to you as I move to my conclusion, as we talk about where do we go from here, that we must honestly face the fact that the movement must address itself to the question of restructuring the whole of American society. There are 40 million poor people here, and one day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? And when you begin to ask that question, you are raising a question about the economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth. And when you ask that question, you begin to question the capitalistic economy. And I'm simply saying that more and more we've got to begin to ask questions about the whole society. We're called upon to help the discouraged beggars in life's marketplace, but one day we must come to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. And he goes on, I'm not talking about communism. What I'm saying to you this morning is communism forgets that life is individual. Capitalism forgets that life is social. And the kingdom of brotherhood is found neither in the thesis of communism or the antithesis of capitalism, but in a higher synthesis. It is found in a higher synthesis that combines the truth of both. Now, when I say questioning the whole society, it means ultimately coming to see that the problems of racism, the problems of economic exploitation, and the problems of war are all tied together. These are the triple evils that are interrelated. By this time, Martin Luther King was under criticism from almost everywhere. The mainstream media was regularly calling him a communist and a traitor. He made an enemy of Lyndon Johnson for his criticism of the Vietnam War. He was accused of harming his own people by speaking to issues outside of his concern. He even lost the support of other black civil rights leaders who saw in his attention to these broader issues a betrayal of the cause of racial equality. The trouble was that he was serious. He meant it. The 1963 dream of racial equality had expanded to the hard work of economic justice for all people. In 1967, he conceived and initiated the Poor People's Campaign, hoping to organize all walks of American life to raise consciousness and affect public policy. As we consider this legacy, it seems important that we understand the underlying faith and spiritual beliefs of this complicated man. Legend has it that Martin Luther King carried 2 well-worn and battered books with him wherever he went. One of them was Civil Disobedience by Henry David Thoreau. And one of them was Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman. That is a book, by the way, that I highly recommend to you. Jesus and the Disinherited. Sounds like it's going to be about Christian theology. It's actually a profound and thoughtful how do I want to say this? Profound and thoughtful examination of what it means to live a good life. Highly recommend that book to you. The Jesus of Howard Thurman and the Jesus of Martin King is Jesus seen as religious leader and religious teacher rather than as a religious object. And I invite you to ponder that subtle yet profound distinction for a moment. To see Jesus as religious leader rather than religious object is to focus on his words and deeds in their original context, rather than upon the theology that has dominated Christianity for so many centuries. And when you do that, if you take the time to look at the words, the deeds, the teachings of Jesus in their original context and let go of the theology, I tell you, everything you think you know about Jesus and Christianity is changed. Thurman begins with the observation that Jesus was first and foremost a Jew. His homeland occupied by a foreign army, his people having few civil rights, almost no protection under the law. And Jesus was a poor Jew, almost certainly illiterate. Thurman understands that when Jesus is speaking in the gospel, he is not thinking about white people in 20th century America. Right? This is not in his head when he is teaching and preaching. Right? He is speaking to his fellow Jews. He's speaking to people who are also poor, who are oppressed by the Romans, who are heavily taxed, who are at the whim of any passing soldier. He is speaking to people whose situation is somewhat similar to what people of color have lived through in the United States for almost all of our history. Again, if you study the teachings in this context, everything you think you know about Jesus and Christianity is turned on its head. Thurman wrote, Jesus recognized with authentic realism that anyone who permits another to determine the quality of his inner life gives into the hands of the other the keys to his destiny.
Would you say that?
I would. Jesus recognized that anyone who permits another to determine the quality of his inner life gives into the hands of the other the keys to his destiny. And you might interpret that as sort of a political statement about oppression, but I invite you to consider that in a whole different way. I invite you to consider that all of us live in a world where we are inundated, we are marinated, we are bombarded with materialism that controls our inner life in ways we don't even understand. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Here's a passage from 1967 where King is using the Bible to make his central point. One night, a juror came to Jesus and wanted to know what he could do to be saved. Jesus didn't get bogged down on the kind of isolated approach that you shouldn't do. Jesus didn't say, now, Nicodemus, you must stop lying. He didn't say, now, Nicodemus, you must not commit adultery. He didn't say, Nicodemus, you must stop cheating if you're doing that. He didn't say, Nicodemus, you must stop drinking liquor if you're doing that excessively. He said something different because Jesus realized something basic, that if a man will lie, he will steal. And if a man will steal, he will kill. So instead of getting bogged down on one thing, Jesus looked at him and said, Nicodemus, you must be reborn. In other words, your whole structure must be changed. A nation that will keep people in slavery for 244 years will thingify them and make them things. And therefore they will exploit them and poor people generally economically. And a nation that will exploit economically will have to have foreign investments and everything else, and it will have to use its military might to protect them. All of these problems are tied together. What I'm saying today is that we must go out from this convention and say, America, you must be reborn again. Notice how the focus of this preaching, and that's pretty damn good preaching. Notice how the focus is on what Jesus said and did, has nothing to do with who Jesus was or might have been, or any theological constructions around that. Notice that the interpretation is multi-leveled. In other words, the message speaks to the spirit of an individual seeker, but it also speaks to the social and political arena. Martin King, informed by Jesus, is telling us that the internal realities of our spirits and the external realities of politics and culture cannot be compartmentalized or separated in any meaningful way. They are inextricably woven in all of our hearts and souls. The spiritual is the political. The political is always spiritual. The Christian faith of Martin Luther King was a justification for tearing down the structures of authority. The exact opposite of how Christianity had been used for 1,700 years. And underneath this is the more central teaching of Jesus, which is that God's abiding love is not for just a select few, but it is for everyone, for all of God's creatures, no exceptions whatsoever. The teaching is that our role as human beings, as children of God, is to engage the work of healing and reconciliation, and there can be no healing, no reconciliation without justice. The goal is brotherhood. There can be no authentic brotherhood without justice. What Martin King came to in the last years of his life is that the single largest injustice in our world is represented by the huge gap between the haves and the have-nots. He recognized that it is this very system, not just the political and economic system, but the thought system and the belief system which creates and sustains the economic and political system. That is what creates and perpetuates, and always will, a vast underclass of poverty-stricken people, incongruously surrounded by the greatest material wealth the world has ever seen. And the dream of 1963 had grown both wider and deeper. It had become a dream not simply of mainstreaming, but of forging a whole new river. Sadly, if Martin King knew what that river looked like, from having been to the mountaintop that he refers to in the last speech of his life, he did not share the details of its construction. Which is not to say he didn't leave us a model to follow. The shape, the quality, the texture of that new river he had begun to envision remains an unanswered and an extraordinarily inconvenient question for all of us. And despite the tragic end, the faith of Martin King was one of great, unrequited hope. He believed in the cause. He believed it was the right thing and faithful thing to do, even in the face of tremendous odds, even in the very real threat of violence, even in the very high probability of failure. Even failure, Martin King heard from Jesus, does not give us a justification for not trying. In this way, both Jesus and Martin King leave us with a very inconvenient legacy. Where do we go from here? John Marquis posed the question poetically like this: what shall have ultimate dominion? Shall it be dream, or shall it be dust? I believe that to be a people of faith, a community of faith, means that we choose to dream and we put our faith to work. Amen.
Let us rise up tonight with a greater readiness than ever before. Let us stand with a greater determination than ever before, and let us move on in these powerful days, these days of challenge, to make America what it ought to be.